Ever get that, like, sinking feeling, you know?
Mhm.
Like when you just know you're about to get totally ripped off. You're not even sure how much something should cost, but you've got this like nagging feeling in the back of your mind that the other person's about to slap you with a ridiculous price tag.
Oh, absolutely. That's like the word. It's so common though, right?
It is. And today we're going to dive deep into this whole world of pricing strategies when one side, kind of holds all the cards, at least when things kick off.
Yeah, like think about it. We encounter these situations all the time in everyday life. One party knows way more than the other. And it's like, how do you even begin to navigate that? It happens everywhere, from trying to haggle at a flea market to like negotiating a super complex business deal.
Totally.
And economists even have a name for it. They call it information asymmetry.
Information asymmetry. Okay, that sounds kind of intense, but I get what you mean. So let's break it down for our listeners, make it real. Say you got a leaky faucet,
Oh,
right?
the worst.
The worst. So you call a plumber and you're already dreading the bill, but you have absolutely zero clue if it's going to be a 5-minute fix or if your entire kitchen is about to be torn apart.
Right. Like, is it a simple screw tightening or do we need to like excavate the entire plumbing system?
Exactly. And you, the homeowner, are willing to pay whatever it takes because, well, a leaky faucet is not something you can just ignore. But the plumber, who knows what they're thinking?
They're probably thinking, could be a quick fix, could be a whole underground swimming pool down there.
Exactly. It's like they're playing poker with all the cards face up and you're stuck trying to bluff with like a pair of
And the
twos.
stakes are high.
Super high. And this isn't just about, leaky faucets and exasperated homeowners, is it? This is a dynamic that pops up everywhere.
All the time. Think about a government, right? They're trying to negotiate a price for a life-saving drug. Lives are on the line. They're under pressure to get a deal done. They might be willing to spend like anything. But the pharmaceutical company on the other side, they might still be figuring out the final production costs, especially if like the research is ongoing.
So how in the world do you set a price when you're dealing with that level of uncertainty? It's like trying to hit a moving target in a pitch black room. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've got this super fascinating research paper, Pricing Novel Goods. And they're tackling this question that honestly we've all probably faced in some form or another. How should sellers even begin to approach setting prices when they're going to learn crucial information after that initial, back and forth, but before the deal is actually done?
It's such a good question. And this paper really gets into the nitty-gritty of how these situations actually play out. Because, like, on the surface, you might think, well, duh, just wait until you know everything before you name a price, right?
Right. Seems pretty logical. But something tells me it's not quite that simple. After all, time is money, right? And delays. Well, delays can be super costly.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. The paper highlights that very point. They even talk about this thing called a discount factor.
Okay, discount factor. I'm listening.
It's basically this idea that, like, things are just worth less in the future. Think about, wouldn't you be way more excited about a sale happening, like, right now, today, versus having to wait, like, a few
Oh,
months?
100%. Yeah. That instant gratification factor.
Exactly. That feeling of, I need it now. That's the discount factor in action.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So delays can cost the seller money, for sure. But isn't there also, like, a major risk for the buyer if everyone rushes into things too quickly? I mean, what's stopping the seller, like our poor, stressed out plumber, from giving a super low initial estimate just to get their foot in the door? And then once they've seen the disaster zone that is your plumbing, they're like, oh, yeah, about that price.
That's the million-dollar question right there. Or the million-dollar plumbing bill, maybe, in this case. And that's what makes this whole pricing dilemma so tricky. You've got these
Wow.
competing incentives, and nobody wants to get the short end of the stick.
So it's like this total pricing standoff, right? The buyer is over here sweating bullets, terrified of getting completely taken advantage of, and the seller is trying to avoid like going bankrupt just because they underpriced something. It's a mess. How do you even begin to find a solution that works for everyone involved?
Well, that's where this paper, like, really shines. They dive into this whole idea of two-part tariffs as a way to, like, even the playing field a little bit when you're dealing with this information imbalance.
Two-part tariffs. Okay, yeah. I think I've definitely run into those out in the wild, but I'm not gonna lie, I've always been a little fuzzy on the like inner workings of the whole thing.
Yeah, it can seem a little complicated at first, but it's actually pretty intuitive once you break it down. Imagine this. Instead of the plumber showing up, poking around for 5 minutes, and then hitting you with this, like, astronomical price tag based on their expert assessment, what if they gave you some options up front?
Okay, yeah, I like this already. More transparency.
Right. So they offer you, say, a couple of different packages before they even lay a wrench on anything. Each package comes with like a fixed fee and then a preset hourly rate for the actual labor.
So like if it's a minor leak, I pay the fixed fee plus a little extra for the time it takes to actually fix it. But then if it turns out my bathroom sink is actually like some kind of portal to a hidden underground world.
You're still covered.
Yeah.
That pre-agreed hourly rate has your back. And that's kind of the brilliance of this whole system. It incentivizes the plumber to be upfront about like the potential scope of the job, right? They can't just come in, see a money pit, and then jack up the price once they've already started ripping out your walls.
Right. It protects the buyer from those surprise charges. And for the buyer, it just takes away so much of that anxiety, right? No more sitting there watching the clock and like multiplying hourly rates in your head, just waiting for that invoice to come back with like a zillion zeros on it. But I have to imagine there's more to this whole two-part tariff thing than meets the eye. Right? We're talking about like cutting edge economics here, not just, Home Depot DIY tips.
You're totally right. There's a twist. The paper points out that the fixed fee in these two-part tariffs, the upfront cost, it doesn't actually have to be like a positive number.
Wait, what? A negative fixed fee? So like, are you telling me the plumber might actually pay me to let them fix my leaky faucet?
It sounds crazy. But yeah, that's exactly what it means. Remember that whole discount factor thing we were talking about earlier? How like psychologically that sense of urgency makes things feel more valuable to us in the moment?
Oh yeah, totally. Instant gratification is a powerful drug.
Right. So a seller who's really, really eager to lock in a deal might actually be willing to offer like a discount up front. They call it a negative fixed fee.
Yeah.
But you kind of think about it like a signing bonus, you know? It's like they're trying to compensate the buyer for taking on any of that like uncertainty or risk that comes with signing on the dotted line before everything is totally ironed out.
So it's this like intricate dance between risk and reward, right?
Yeah.
Both the buyer and the seller are trying to figure out the best strategy, how much risk they're willing to take on, and how to like find that sweet spot where everyone feels like they're getting a fair shake.
Exactly. It's so much more dynamic than the old school way of doing things, right?
Yeah.
Just slapping a single price tag on something and hoping for the best. This is next level stuff.
Totally. I'm starting to see why this paper really caught your eye. It's like, yeah, we can talk about plumbers and leaky faucets all day, but these ideas, they apply to so many different negotiations and transactions, right?
Absolutely. Think about like a software developer who's negotiating a contract with a client, right?
Yeah.
And the client has like this big vision, but maybe the project scope is still a little bit, up in the air. Or like even a freelancer who charges a retainer fee up front, but then has like an hourly rate once the project details get more solidified.
It's all around us if we know what to look for. Okay, so two-part tariffs. They're like this super interesting solution to this whole information asymmetry problem, in theory. But let's be real, right? How practical is the stuff in the real world? Can you imagine trying to explain the concept of a negative fixed fee to someone who just wants to know how much it's going to cost to get their dishwasher working again?
I know.
Right? It's like sometimes you just need someone to tell you a price, No equations, no like economics jargon, just a straightforward, this is how much it costs.
Absolutely. Not everything has to be a PhD dissertation. And, the paper does actually acknowledge that these like super intricate two-part tariffs, while they're really cool in theory, they're not always going to be the most, user-friendly or practical, especially when we're talking about everyday situations.
Okay, good. I'm glad they touched on that because, yeah, imagine trying to explain a negative fixed fee to someone who's like freaking out because their washing machine is making this weird grinding noise.
Right. Like some things just need a simple solution, right?
Exactly. So what's the alternative? Did the paper offer any like more realistic options for those of us who aren't, economics professors?
They do. They talk about something they call price mechanisms, which, okay, I know another jargony term, but basically it's about finding ways to build more like strategic pricing into the way things are normally done. Like how can we make the pricing itself smarter without having to resort to like separate fixed fees and hourly rates and all that? Think of it like we're trying to design a better price tag.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. So like more in line with what people are used to seeing in the real world, but with some like extra strategy baked in behind the scenes. I like it. So what are some of the options they explore?
Well, one of the big things they emphasize is this trade-off between what they call ex-post pricing and ex-ante pricing. And, we've actually already talked about both of these without even realizing it. Remember our plumber buddy?
Oh, how could I forget? At this point, I'm starting to think I need, like, therapy for my newfound fear of leaky faucets.
Right. So ex-post pricing, it's basically what we were talking about earlier. The plumber shows up, takes a look at the disaster, and then they give you a price based on what they find, right?
Mhm.
Full information for them, but for the buyer, it's like, fingers crossed, this doesn't break the bank.
Yeah, exactly. It's that moment of truth where you're like, please don't let me have to choose between fixing the plumbing and, like, eating for the rest of the month.
Right. But then ex-ante pricing, that flips the script. It'd be like the plumber saying, okay, so I haven't seen your leaky faucet yet, obviously, but typically a repair like that is going to cost somewhere between like X dollars and Y dollars, depending on, how complicated things get once we open everything up.
Okay, yeah. So the plumber is taking on a bit more risk with that approach because they don't know the full extent of the problem yet. But for the buyer, it's like at least you have some idea of what you're getting into up front, right? You're not just signing a blank check and hoping for the best. It's like the distance between ordering like a la carte and just going for the prefix menu.
Yeah. Oh, that's a perfect analogy. Love it. And what's really interesting is that the paper actually points out that the best approach, like the most strategic approach, often involves like a mix of both, a little ex post, a little ex ante.
That makes sense. Why limit yourself? Right.
Right. Like maybe our plumber friend, they offer a fixed price for like those super common repairs, like unclogging a sink or whatever. But then for those weird situations that require a ton of investigation and like plumbing detective work, they switch over to like an ex post system.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance, right? Managing risk for the seller, but also giving the buyer enough information and transparency to actually feel good about, handing over their credit card. But now you've got me thinking, what if the unknown in the equation? What if it isn't just about like the cost of the service or the product itself? What if like just figuring out how much something should cost? What if that's expensive too?
Oh, that is an excellent point. You're totally right. That adds this whole other layer of complexity. And, this paper, it's so good because it addresses this too. They make this distinction between what they call necessary learning and like optional learning.
Okay, interesting. Necessary versus optional learning. Tell me everything.
So necessary learning, think about it like this. Imagine you're investing in research and development for like a brand new product, something that's never existed before.
Okay. Yeah.
You can't just slap a price tag on that and call it a day, right?
Yeah.
You need to figure out how to even make the dang thing. And that takes time, it takes resources, and it often takes a ton of money.
Right. It's like back to our plumber friend. That's like them having to, I don't know, break open your walls just to figure out what the heck is going on behind the tiles. They can't even give you an accurate estimate, let alone start fixing things until they know what they're dealing with.
Yeah, exactly. Necessary learning. We've got to do it, but it's probably going to cost us. Optional learning, on the other hand, it's a little different. It's more like, well, we could make a decision right now, but, maybe getting a second opinion would give us some extra information and help us, like, avoid any major disasters down the road.
So sticking with our plumber, who's probably like ready to retire by now after all these hypothetical leaky faucet situations, optional learning might be like them calling up, I don't know, like the plumbing Yoda, the most experienced plumber in the world, to get their take on like a particularly unusual or like super challenging problem.
Exactly. It's an extra expense, right?
Yeah.
Calling in the plumbing Yoda. But it just might be worth it to avoid, like, making a mistake that ends up costing even more money or causing a huge delay in the project.
Right. Sometimes that upfront investment in information is worth it in the long run.
Totally. And that's what the paper does such a good job of highlighting. It's like the optimal way to approach pricing. It changes depending on whether we're talking about necessary or optional learning.
Yeah.
And both sides need to be aware of that, right? The seller, who's trying to figure out what the price should be, and the buyer, who's trying to decide, like, do I sign this contract or run for the hills?
This has been, like, honestly, a fascinating deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about this whole, like, hidden world that shapes the prices we see for, well, pretty much everything, right?
Right. It's everywhere.
But before we wrap things up, I want to make sure our listeners walk away from this with some, like, actionable advice. What can they do with all this information?
That's such a good point.
Mm-hmm.
It can't just be, like, interesting trivia, right? So, first and foremost, just remember, information asymmetry. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's like the air we breathe.
Yeah.
It's always there, and it's always playing a role in how prices are set. I mean, everything from the cup of coffee you buy on your way to work to that, like, vintage guitar you've been eyeing for months. It's all influenced by this stuff.
It's like, don't just blindly accept the first price someone throws at you. Think about the incentives that might be at play, you know? What are they thinking? What don't I know? Could a two-part tariff actually work in this situation? And like, even if it's not explicitly a two-part tariff situation, could you try to like frame it that way to make it more fair for everyone involved?
Yes, exactly. And especially when we're talking about big purchases, like big commitments, don't be afraid to ask questions. Do your research. Knowledge is power in these situations. The more information you have, the better equipped you are to negotiate a price that feels fair.
Absolutely. Now, for our final thought for today. The paper touches on this idea of like ex post efficiency, which it's a mouthful, I know. But essentially, it's asking this question. Is it actually possible for the buyer to end up in a better position, to get a better deal, even in a situation where initially the seller had way more information? What does that say about fairness? What does that say about like the balance of power in transactions? Stuff to think about.
It really makes you think, like, what is a fair price when information is constantly in flux? What should we be willing to pay when we're operating from a place of, like, incomplete information? Really interesting stuff to ponder next time you find yourself, I don't know, haggling over the price of, like, a vintage vinyl record or something.
Right. Or, you know, a house or a car.
Exactly.
Well, that is all the time we have for today's deep dive. This was awesome. But don't worry, we'll be back soon with another episode and another fascinating topic that'll hopefully get you thinking about the world in some new and interesting ways. See you next time.